Hello again, students. Good to be able to talk to you. I hope this works well. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe. In this video clip, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a subject your book mentions some, but I think doesn't give it enough depth that I would like for it to have. This is a concept called the Internet of Things, often referred to as IoT. It's been described to me as being a tsunami of technology, this massive wave, this overcoming of a new concept, not really new, but a new concept of how we can generate all this mass of data that we talked about in the previous video of big data. The Internet of Things is definitely a very, very, very important topic that is becoming very significant in the business world today. And I'd like to go over in the next 15, 20 minutes, go over some of the concepts, and then I want to have you watch a couple other videos that explain a little more in depth about the Internet of Things. What is the Internet of Things? Well, there's lots of different definitions. I have a slide on my PowerPoint that talks about what it is. Basically, what the Internet of Things involves is having devices on the internet that are connected to other devices. That's why it's referred to as the Internet of Things. This requires very little, if any, human intervention. And this is really the kind of thing that is driving an awful lot of new applications in information technologies these days, and is also the major force of coming up with the idea of big data. It's the Internet of Things that is really generating the massive quantities, those exabytes and zettabytes of data I talked about earlier. So what is the Internet of Things? It's basically a network of devices that are interconnected that can communicate with other devices. They do this either for generation of more data or do it for control purposes, as we will see. So it's really an interesting concept, and it's one you really need to be very much aware of. The Internet of Things can do an awful lot of different items, as we will see. And one of the things that I want you to do is to do a research project on the Internet of Things, and I'll make that assignment probably shortly after I post this video. Essentially, what this is a way by which devices can and do control other devices. It's an interesting thing. The next slide that I talk about looks at the forces that are behind the Internet of Things. Now, the concept of the Internet of Things is not as new as we might think. It really took off about 8 years ago. The concept was named by a fella who, and I forget his name, I think it's Ashton something or another, anyway, it doesn't matter. In 1999, he coined this phrase, the Internet of Things, and he was a futurist technologist that foresaw what was coming in about a decade or so. So look at the driving forces. We have sensors that can measure almost anything and everything. We have very cheap computing these days. We have the ability to run devices with minimal amount of power. We have, as you've read about the mobile devices, you're familiar with the cloud and big data analytics, which we'll talk about at a later point, really is the driving force behind this. So look at this. Sensor technologies. What's a sensor? Well, a sensor is something that can measure something. And the next slide, I have an example. There's an accelerometer. Every one of your smartphones has an accelerometer built right into it. There's a force sensor. that is here that can measure how much pressure things have. There's a pulse sensor. There's sensors for all kinds of things. Matter of fact, if you look at the next slide looks at all of the different kinds of things that we can measure using these sensors. We can measure pressures, we can measure temperature, we can measure flow of gases, flow of water, we can measure temperature, whatever you want to measure, pressure, it can all be measured because they're developing these sensors. We have more and more sensors being developed every day. These sensors can, if you look at your smartphone, there are sensors to determine whether the smartphone is at level. Like I mentioned earlier, you have an accelerometer in it, so it can tell how fast it's moving. It has all these devices that are very, very small and require a minimal amount of power to be able to measure things. On top of that, we have many computers, very, very, very small computers. The next slide talks about it. It shows a computer. It's about the size of a penny, a little bigger than a penny. It only costs a couple of bucks. And the prices of these things are being driven down constantly. By having these sensors attached to computers, we are able to do things that were unheard of or even unthought of a decade ago. It's amazing. We have this development in terms of power. That's the next slide, where we can power devices for a long time. Very, very small power. More and more, we're getting solar power that can actually generate and maintain some of the applications, especially in agriculture, are using solar power to power some of the sensors and some of these cheap computers that enable us to develop this Internet of Things concept. We have, as we've seen, all kinds of connectivity. The next slide talks about it. I mentioned IPv6 when I talked about networking back when we were still together. IPv6 is simply a new way of defining how Internet IP addresses are allocated. And basically, with IPv6, there is essentially an unlimited number. There is obviously a finite number, but it's such a large number that we'll never run out of in our lifetime and your lifetime and probably your kids' lifetime, the ability to have all of these addresses. It's up in the, well, I forget exactly how many zeros are behind it, but it's a huge, huge number. It's well in the scope of the Brotobyte thing. So anyway, I've listed some other technologies here that allow for the connectivity. And the beauty of the connectivity is the fact that we can connect all these sensors and all these cheap computers onto the internet without human intervention and be able to control and to measure and to generate data in ways that we simply couldn't before. The next slide just shows the mobile devices. You're all familiar with the mobile devices. I won't tarry on this slide particularly, but mobile devices are also very, very important in the Internet of Things because these mobile devices allow us to interconnect with these devices wherever we are, any place, so that if we want, for instance, in the smart home, which I'll talk about in a minute, if I want to control my thermostat from my office, I can do that because it's all connected. One of the beauties and one of the major driving forces is the fact that we have the cloud. What is the cloud? Well, you know what the cloud is. I've asked you to do some research in the cloud. Most of you did it. I'm happy about that. But basically, the cloud allows us to have this massive connection and this massive data storage and computing capability that I can have these devices hooked up to the cloud, generating data automatically so that we have the ability to deal with the big data we talked about earlier. The next slide talks about the Internet of Devices applications. This is a projection. This projection is about 2 years old. It's a little behind time because it shows in this, if you look at it, there's about 30 billion IoT devices were projected for this year. The latest report that I've read said that there will be about 37 billion IoT devices by the end of 2020. Now, that was before this huge pandemic we're suffering. That may slow it down for a bit, but once we get back to normal business activity, I suspect that this slide, as you can see, this growth again is an exponential growth, and that is not unusual. This idea, the next slide, talks about the convergence of everything and everywhere. Basically, what that is saying is that more and more, especially driven by forces like big data and the Internet of Things, more and more we're getting all of these technologies are coming together. The cloud technology, the applications, everything is moving in the same direction. And then the following slide talks a little bit more about this convergence, because it talks about IoT as the driving force behind a lot of this. Big data needs lots of data. Well, IoT generates lots and lots and lots of data, because we have these billions of devices that are generating data daily, creating massive quantities of data that are made available for business analytics, which we'll talk about in a following video. The cloud allows us to have this. The cloud allows massive data storage. We talked about big data storage. I asked you to look at the concept and look at the videos about technologies like Hadoop that enable us that all of these data we're generating, we can collect these data, we can put these data together. IoT generates it. As you can see, this is it. I like this slide. It says IoT is the king, big data is the queen, and the cloud is their palace. This is where it all comes together. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it sure sounds good. The next slide talks about projections in the future. I want you to read through this. I'm not going to take the time in the video clip to talk about this. But if you look at this closely, it'll give you a feel for exactly how terribly important this concept of IoT is. It is incredible, and it's going to grow and grow and grow. As we get more and more sensors developed, as computing prices keep coming down, which they will, and as we now have the ability to have the connectivity, it is just absolutely incredible. The following slide, I want you to go through this. It talks about big data applications. It talks about big data and analytics. Go through this. It's an automatic slide. You can play with it if you want. That's fine. I don't want to take the time right now because I don't want you to spend all the time listening to my talk here. What I want you to do is be able to go through, look at these. It is a pretty good slide in terms of how the IoT devices are changing the world. The last things I want to talk about in this video clip are just to give you an idea of some of the IoT applications that we see. The first application I talk about is the smart home. The smart home simply is, how can I take the Internet of Things and use it in my daily life in my house? So this gives you some examples. There are all kinds of smart devices, quote unquote, smart devices that are now coming out. Smart thermostats, where all you can do, if you can control your house wherever you are remotely. We have smart garage door openers. My garage door opener can be hooked to the internet, and I can control on my smartphone. I can look to see if my garage door is open. I can make sure my garage door is closed. I can open it remotely, any place, any time. if I want. And it's, in other words, if I had a neighbor that I'm away from there and there's something in my garage or something in my home that they want, I could actually open my garage door for them remotely so that they could go into my house without having a key, which is a good thing, and maybe not so good thing if it's a crook. I don't want a crook going to my house. But anyway, we have things like a smart refrigerator. Smart refrigerators have sensors on the shelves that can tell what you have on the shelves. If you put them in the proper place, it can tell you how many eggs you have in the egg container. It can do all kinds of things, and you can use this smart. When you're shopping, it can actually automatically add to a shopping list if you want to do that. This isn't fantasy. You can buy a smart refrigerator today. Samsung has been producing smart refrigerators now for at least 2 or 3 years. Very much, very common. We have all these home security devices. We can have home cameras where you can watch and control from your smartphone, cameras that are attached to the internet that you can control remotely. We have basically one of the interesting things, you can turn on your lights remotely. If you want to have lights come on or off, you can turn them on or off if they're hooked to the internet. So the smart home, as you can see, there's a lot of different things that it talks about. I don't want to take up a whole lot of time talking about the smart home. Rather look at some of the more interesting things in terms of IoT in business. IoT in healthcare is an amazing concept. Most of you are probably familiar with the devices that you can wear. Like, I used to wear a Fitbit. I quit wearing it since, I don't know why, I just got tired of wearing the silly thing. But it was nice because it would track how much I walked, and I'd put things on my phone that I could see about what was going on. It did it automatically. Could track my sleep. It could do all kinds of interesting things that were kind of cool. But that's just the beginning. They have devices now that you can wear and can sense how your body is functioning. For instance, they have sensors that can measure your pulse rate. They have sensors. I'm sure you've probably seen this ad for this device that you can put your hands on and give you an EKG, and they'll send it to your doctor. All this is part of the Internet of Things, this whole concept. This slide talks about the various kinds of monitors that people can wear. I read not too long ago about an IoT device that people with heart issues can wear, and if they are about to have a heart attack or having a heart attack, can automatically notify the hospital, your doctor, and the EMT guys, and the EMT guys can come and get you. They'll sense exactly where you are because we have GPS now, and so it's pretty amazing what some of these things are doing. And this is just the beginning. The next slide talks about transportation. I want to talk a little bit about this. This will be the last application I talk about tonight. But it talks about how IoT has changed the transportation industry. As you can see, logistics, performance tracking, etc. Let's go through this a little bit. The idea of logistics, radio frequency identification, tagging, and barcoding, and other things allow us to tag and know exactly where anything is in transport. The radio frequency IDs, there are 2 types. You can have passive or you can have active RFIDs. Basically what these are allow us to track in terms of, as we're shipping things, wherever and whatever we're shipping. We know exactly where it is, and this isn't a big shock to you. But 15 years ago, that would have been incredibly impossible that we could know exactly. You can track, I think UPS, I believe it is, now has a system where if you register with them and you're getting a package, you can go online and it shows you exactly where the truck is at any point in time, so you'll know exactly when the truck's about to get to your house. IoT. Okay, the idea of routing using GPS and using IoT devices, transformers that are within trucks that transmit to through GPS systems so that the dispatchers know exactly where the trucks are at any point in time. They can route them or reroute them if they need to. They can come up with the best way of getting it. As you can see, the trucking industry, the navigation, in advance. You can get where the filling stations are. You can know what the weather is. If you need to be rerouted because of a detour or an accident, they can do this automatically. The sky's the limit in terms of what we can do and what we'll be able to do in terms of logistics and using the Internet of Things. It's incredible. The next slide. Once upon a time, drivers had to keep a log. Now we can keep the log automatically because with IoT devices, we know exactly where the truck is, how long the driver's been working. An IoT device can be actually hooked up on the driver. If the driver's starting to get sleepy, can play music automatically, wake them up, inform them that, hey, it's time for a truck stop, better stop and get a cup of coffee. As you can see, the level of the vehicle, how well is it performing? How long is it gone? Is something about to break down? Are there going to be problems? How well is the emissions? All of this can be sensed through these sensors that can then relay these data to the trucking companies so that they know exactly where their trucks are, where their drivers are, and how they're performing. A caveat to that, and we're going to look at this a little bit, autonomous vehicles. The next slide is a reality. This is, you probably have seen in some insurance companies where they have advertisements where if you want, they'll give you a device that you just plug right into your car's computer, and it will track what a safe driver you are. It tracks things like how far you drive, and how fast you drive, and how you drive. Now, I don't have one in my car. I've been offered one. My insurance agent, once upon a time, was my brother-in-law, and he offered me one, and I told him what he could do with the device because I don't want anybody to know exactly how I drive. But if you're willing to put one of these devices in your car, and the insurance company can track how well you're driving, the safe driving thing, they'll give you a discount. It's a discount I forego, but they'll give you a discount. It's IoT in action. The next slide talks about autonomous vehicles. A lot of people are pretty happy about the concept of a driverless car, a car that can drive itself. Now, this is a reality. About 4 years ago, it was demonstrated that a car driving from San Francisco to the East Coast could navigate by itself completely across the United States. It was done, I think, by Delco, I believe, was the company that equipped the car. But you have to understand, this is coming. And why is it coming? Because we have these sensors. This slide about the autonomous vehicle shows you some of the sensors. Now, many of the sensors are already in cars today. And some car manufacturers, like Telsa, will have a car, and if you're willing to pay for it, will have a car that can actually drive itself. There's some question about the safety, but many people, many experts believe that in the not too distant future, and that's probably not too distant future as 10 to 15 years, there will be as many driverless cars available on the highway as there are cars that are being equipped by human drivers. Now, there's some advantages. There might be some disadvantages. Some of the advantages of the driverless car is that it could be a lot safer. A lot of accidents happen because of people not paying attention to the road. For instance, distracted by cell phones. Not that you ever would, but people do sometimes get distracted by texting while driving. Not in Indiana. It's against the law after the 1st of July, so don't do that. But it happens, and it happens quite frequently. A lot of people believe that autonomous vehicles are the way of the future. The next slide talks about having a smart highway. And what would be a smart highway? Well, it would be a highway that had sensors in it. Sensors that could determine traffic patterns. Sensors that could, depending upon the weather, change the speed limit. If it's a good day, beautiful, clear, low traffic volume, the speed limits could be raised. And especially with autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles would recognize that there's cars ahead and behind, and therefore they could be much more safe than cars that are being driven by people who are distracted. A smart highway could sense weather conditions. If there was an accident, it could give people plenty of time to make detours. These are things that we can't do today. I don't know if any of you have ever sat in a traffic jam for an hour or two because there was an accident on a highway and you just couldn't, you were on an interstate and you couldn't get off, just sat there. Well, that wouldn't happen if we had the smart highways. Chances of that accident would be somewhat removed. I mentioned in the trucking industry right now that many people are working on autonomous trucks that will drive themselves. That's going to have a major impact. And this is but one of the applications of the Internet of Things. This is the last set of slides. I could have gone on and on and on about this. And I want you to go on and on and on about this because I'm going to make an assignment for each of you to go on the internet and find applications in business of the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is everywhere. It's in retail, it's in agriculture. It's amazing what's going on in agriculture. And I want you to find out. The book doesn't talk about this as much as I ought to. And that's one of the issues that I've had with the text. I don't think it's quite as up to date as it ought to be in some of the technologies that are available today. So I hope you watch the videos, clips that I suggest here about the Internet of Things, and I hope that you learn quite a bit about this tsunami that has taken over.